Hello, and welcome to Out in Space, the podcast for LGBT astronomers and allies. I am Vlad. I'm an assistant professor of astronomy at an MSU, and I am bisexual.
I'm
Great.
Cass. I'm a Winton Fellow in Theoretical Astrophysics and Exoplanets at the University of Leicester, and I'm gay.
I'm Alex Ticci. I'm a graduate student at Columbia University, and I'm gay.
I'm Jody Burtis. I am a graduate student at New Mexico State University, and I'm gay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So today we have joining us Jennifer Connelly, who, as of today, is a senior lecturer in the School of Physics and Astronomy at the Rochester Institute of Technology. She received her bachelor's from Dickinson College, her MA in astronomy from Wesleyan, and a PhD in extragalactic astronomy from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich in Germany. She is the faculty advisor for the Space Exploration Group on campus and is one of the leaders of the Inclusive Excellence Initiative. The 5-year $1 million program is funded by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and focuses on transforming faculty to better support all students, including those from non-traditional pathways. She is the founder of Rochester Women in Physics and Astronomy Networking Group, and she is also the coordinator of the Rochester pod of 500 women scientists. In recognition of her efforts, Connelly received the 2019 Isaac L. Jordan Senior Faculty Pluralism Award, recognizing her significant contribution to diversity and inclusion with and outside of RIT. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you. I sound very fancy when you say it all in one breath. I'm glad to be here with you guys.
Good. So I guess, first of all, maybe we can just ask some questions and you can kind of tell us a little bit about yourself. So first of all, can you tell us a bit about your science, what you're working on at the moment, and just where you identify on the LGBT spectrum?
Sure, I'll start with the second part. So I'd identify as bisexual, and I'm a queer woman. So I wish we had more genders to easily work with. At least when I was growing up, that wasn't an option. I grew up in a rural place. Not that that means automatically people are not understanding, but in my case, that was the case. So I sort of call myself queer generally, but if I have to pick a box, bisexual woman is usually the set that I check. And I definitely have been gifted with a lot of learning from my students in recent years. They have taught me a lot even now, so that's a gift. So that's where I sort of identify. My science. So as a PhD student, I became really obsessed with galaxies and how to characterize their evolution. So I looked at galaxies in the optical and the X-ray in groups. So I compared things that were living with other galaxies to things that were off by themselves, field galaxies and then things that were in clusters, so the really social galaxies. So that's where I started out with my own science, and I still do some of that today, but mostly now I've shifted to supporting undergraduate research. And I'm an observational astronomer by nature, so I usually end up finding projects that students can really own themselves, which means it's maybe not the higher level science, but they get to be part of the experimental design process and the data taking process. We have a telescope at RIT, but we also go to Kitt Peak National Observatory every year, which I've started going to when I myself was an undergrad, so it's a weird full circle for me at the moment, coming back. But yeah, so now we do a lot of variable star work, exoplanet transits, that kind of jazz.
Oh, really nice. I love exoplanet transits for students. I think it's a really great teaching tool. Yeah, really good. I think as well, research focused and research based learning is so productive for students because it teaches them so many skills that you just can't teach in the classroom in the same way. I think it's really important.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So normally we kind of take it in turns to ask questions. So Jody, would you like to maybe ask another one?
Sure, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about your coming out experience, particularly in the in the workplace, and did you fear that it might affect you professionally?
Yeah, so I think, old joke about bisexuals, right, is that we just have to come out again and again and again. And that's definitely been my experience. I did not come out at all until I was in my 20s. So I was closeted until that point, and then dealt, I think, with a lot of shame around that, because as a bisexual person, I could just date guys, and everyone thought I was just straight, and so I sort of hid for a while. And then once I moved up to Wesleyan especially, and then when I worked in New York City at the Museum of Natural History for a while there, I just felt very comfortable, and then it just wasn't a big deal. So I didn't have a big coming out, but occasionally I do have to remind people that I'm not straight. That comes up a lot. And so I was fearful about coming out, both for my family and friends, and also professionally. I didn't have a sense of how accepted that was. In astronomy, I saw a lot of women around, especially younger women, but everybody seemed pretty cis and straight, at least the ones I was interacting with. So I wasn't really sure for a while. And I'm glad to see now that, if you go to a AAS meeting or things like that, there are visible groups. And I mean, this podcast is awesome, right? You're really kind of highlighting that we exist and are a vital part of our subfields and astronomy in general. But yeah, I wasn't quite sure how it was gonna go, and it really went differently in different places. In New York City, it was just fine. Everything was fine. And in Germany, the fact that I was a woman doing my PhD and postdoc there didn't feel like a big deal, but the fact that I wasn't straight was. I quickly learned the German word for homosexual. And it's funny because it's very close to humid. So I was confused for a while. I did not speak German when I went there. So I couldn't understand why some of my German office mates kept talking about like how humid it was. It was me. I was apparently, I don't know, damp.
It's really weird.
That's really
it just
weird.
it's one of those one of those consequences of an umlaut, right, is to someone who didn't grow up hearing it, you don't hear the umlaut. To the Germans are like, that word is totally different. To me, I was like, why the humidity? Why is this a thing all the time? I don't understand. Yeah, so, and then coming back to RIT, I wasn't sure what the culture was there. So I think sometimes my experience has been that if you're in an astronomy department, it might be different than if you're an astronomer in a large physics department. The subcultures, I think, tend to be different, at least in the US.
It's really interesting as well that you're saying that in Germany, like, you experience, kind of your queerness was more of an issue than your gender. And kind of fairly uniformly, I'd say, on this podcast, we've been hearing it's generally the other way around. It's generally being female is kind of harder than being queer. And actually last week we were talking about how some lesbians somehow almost have male privilege because the world sees us as more masculine, so they trust our judgment more because we're seen as more masculine. And I've been enjoying my male privilege ever since. So
congratulations.
But it's really interesting to hear this viewpoint, and I'm sorry that experience wasn't positive for you in Germany.
Well, I think the overall experience was, I just had to ignore some of my office mates for a while. The other ones were fabulous. I have an Italian office mate that I'm still dear friends with. And he was not judgmental in the slightest. It was never an issue with him. But I think because I was in Munich, it's akin to the south of many countries, right? You have this idea of, well, Texas, for instance. There's a big accent difference from the rest of the country, and a religious difference in the population. And I think having a lot of Bavarians around meant that if I had been, for instance, in Berlin, I might have had a totally different experience in Germany. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's the people in charge. Sometimes it's the tone that they set for their department and what's acceptable and not, and the water cooler talk. You know, what's the tone? Are people talking about their families openly, and you feel like you have to edit, or is it just fine? Is it all we're valued and respected? So for me, it's been really variable. It's place to place. It's been very different.
So you say you kept hearing this word floating around you, and you didn't speak much German at the time. I mean, it's sort of remarkable that they're talking about your sexuality so openly. I guess they assumed that you didn't understand them
Yeah,
at the time. Is that
they
were
knew
just
I didn't understand them because they were speaking not just German, they were speaking Bayerisch. So they're speaking this very heavily accented, different phrases.
Different dialects almost.
Different dialect. Exactly.
Yeah,
That's the word I'm going for. A different dialect. So there were two of them in the office when I got there, and they were the ones who were having these discussions, and it took another person who was fluent in German to point it out to me before I realized what was going on.
wow.
And it became really funny too, because they would start attributing gayness to things that I owned as well. You know, had a very gay briefcase for a while. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they were right. I didn't think about
If
that when I picked.
If I can just be blunt for a moment, that's really shitty behavior.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad it didn't happen to me earlier in my career. Because at that point, I kind of went, "You're ignorant."
Right.
I mean, I feel sorry for you that that's your worldview. They didn't have any power over me. That's a huge part of it, right? If my supervisor had talked like that, if my mentor had talked like that, that would have been a real problem for me. And luckily, my mentor was really open-minded and great. He was only a few years older than I was. And we talked openly. It was just never an issue. If I had a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whoever, he didn't judge at all. So that was part of the reason it was easier to deal with and just shrug off as like, oh geez, these guys are not going to get very far with that attitude. I hope.
How was your experience? This is a question that comes up for me all of the time. Is the sort of the unique challenges that we have as members of the community, relocating from place to place, and places like New York City is always, think of as a very open-minded, but also a very great place to meet people. But showing up in a place like Munich or Rochester could be much more challenging. So I wonder what that's been like for you throughout the journey, to the extent that you want to talk about it. Obviously, these locations are,
Yeah, I think now I'm always very wary at the beginning. I'm always very guarded at the beginning. I'm feeling out how do people respond to situations. When I came to Rochester, it really wasn't clear. It's a technical school, and I'm in a physics department, so that's part of that adds like extra layers of wariness for me. And for the most part, my colleagues have been lovely, but there are occasional jokes that I would rather not hear.
Sure.
They're not about me particularly, but I don't want them. And I'm now like the point person for anything queer. So if something comes up in the classroom or with a mentee, it's usually directed to me. So it's weird to be one of the few out professors, and kind of be like a public face of queerdom. That was a new thing in this particular environment for me. At the same time, the student resources are great, and I quickly found our Q center, our Q Affinity Center, and ask them a lot of questions when I don't know the right answer, because I don't know the right answer. Things change quickly, and I think that's not a bad thing. But I occasionally go, wait, is this the right way to, is this, you know, I check myself sometimes. I'm like, guys, I say guys a lot. I don't actually mean that. I mean folks, but I'm working on it.
Sure.
So I'm not some bastion of queerdom, but
I think that's the thing, isn't it? If you're out to somebody, it's like somehow you become a spokesman for the entire LGBTQ rainbow, and you're just like, I don't know, like I don't know, I say the wrong thing all the time, like I use like gendered pronouns in the wrong place, and you know, all of these things, right? We've all got to learn and grow and learn to be better, but it's difficult.
yeah, and it makes me a little anxious sometimes that I am gonna say the wrong thing or represent us the wrong way, you know, and that's multiplied by the fact that I'm a woman in physics, because that's a whole other layer of that same thing, which happens quite frequently, because the population at RIT in terms of the student demographics, the people coming into my classrooms that I'm teaching are largely young, white, cis men. And they don't see that I'm queer necessarily right away, although purple hair and unicorn necklaces might be a flag. But they see that I'm a woman and I'm too young in their minds to have the wisdom to teach them elementary physics.
Yeah. Yeah, it raised an interesting question about the perpetuation of these attitudes. I think, you know, in a physics department, and not to cast too much dispersion against physics departments, but I think we have broadly felt, I mean, I think the general thinking is that astronomy departments tend to be a little more open-minded along these lines than a physics department. But then if you look at the students coming through those programs, you know, if they are overwhelmingly white, well, white too, but overwhelmingly male is what I was going to say. That those attitudes are still kind of getting passed down to the new generation of students in a physics department, maybe preferentially over an astronomy department. Is that your sense that these attitudes are kind of you know, imprinting themselves on the students as well?
Oh yeah, and sometimes I've had to take grad students aside because they've said things that I know are just them echoing what they're hearing from elder men in the field, and it's not okay. And I think part of the reason that physics, we feel it more than astronomy, is physics still has this idea of these lone genius figures, and that you're just going to be a brilliant individual and solve all these amazing problems by yourself. And so we emphasize things like rigor, and we tell ourselves that we just are purely rational beings and the human side doesn't matter in physics more than we do in astronomy. My sister is a biology professor, so she's at the same institute that I am, and I think her experience is completely different than mine, even though we're both professors who are women in the natural sciences, the same place. So the cultures are really like, there's all these levels. There's your local environment, who's in charge and what are the traditions there. And then there's the huge, well, just physics and that almost nearly universal lens. And that takes a long time to change. And I think what I think of kind of like the lone wolf myth that we have in physics is part of the problem.
I think that's fair. I think it's very damaging to think that, you know, science for a long time hasn't been done alone, right? There's huge teams of people working on every discovery now. And I just think, you know, this is part of the reason why I get so angry about the Big Bang Theory. It perpetuates these stereotypes that just aren't there, you know. And we're not these one-dimensional rational beings. We're all human, you know, with all the emotions that go with it. So
yeah, and it's interesting to see that, and you know, like it's something we as a field amplify, right? The Nobel Prize. We still only give it in every field. I mean, like in the fields where it's given, we give it only to 3 persons, right? And nowadays, you know, the situation changed, right? When the prize was first given, the world was completely different, right? We didn't have these mega collaborations that we have nowadays. So it made sense, right? Like most articles were written only by one person, right? I remember seeing the and statistics about that. It only changed in the 70s. It was the first time that multiple author papers were more frequent than single author papers, right? So yeah, the world has changed, and some fields just didn't catch up with that yet, it seems.
Yeah, it just reminded me of when we first were awarded the grant that Cass mentioned at the beginning by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is aimed at kind of transforming the faculty so we can better support our students of all backgrounds, especially non-traditional backgrounds. When we first got it, and during the orientation for this, we were cautioned that what we were trying to do was push against several hundred years of momentum in academia and then within our subfields as well. And that we would fail to meet all of our goals in all likelihood, and that was okay as long as we learned from them. And I keep that in mind, this idea, it's like this giant mountain you're trying to push against that has been built over centuries in scientific circles.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's an awful lot of inertia trying to undo these ideas of harmful stereotypes. Definitely.
We just keep chipping at it.
Yeah, exactly.
And the more people with axes chipping at the mountain, the better.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so perhaps I can ask you another question. You touched briefly on it earlier about, when you're bisexual, you have to keep coming out again and again and again because the world often will perceive you as heterosexual. Would you say that bi erasure has impacted you? Is it mixed in any way? Sometimes is it helpful? Sometimes is it harmful?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of mentioned this sense of shame because you can hide and still have romantic attachments be public. And that, I'm well past that in my life. That's not something I want to do anymore, or would do anymore. But it took a long time for me to get to that feeling deep in my gut that no, I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to hide those things. And if people have a problem, it's their problem. But it's hard when I see my students going through it. That's when, I just want to fix it for them. And I want to tell them not to worry about it, that it won't matter. But it might. So I can't tell them that it won't. And I'm with the students who are bi especially, I try to give them whatever wisdom I have, little bits of it that I've accumulated over the years. But that's also what works for me, and it might not be. There's no single way. Right? There's no single way to be gay.
I think as well, there's often like a position of privilege in, like for me, for example, like I'm out of the closet, I am never going back in again. But, I'm speaking from a position of privilege whereby I don't fear for my employment. I don't fear for, the safety of myself or my wife, really, on the grand scheme of things. So I can be like that. Whereas, if you're already from maybe a different minority community or whatever, like you're fighting all these battles on all these fronts, sometimes you maybe just want to hide because you want an easier life. And, why would anybody blame you for that,
Yeah, and as Alex mentioned earlier, we talked about a bit when you move all the time, which can be really common in our work. You're sort of starting all over again, and especially if you're dating. Let me tell you how fun that has been. that's I've found very challenging. If you know any lovely people in Rochester, let me know. It's place to place is totally different. That culture too, and that has nothing to do with my department, nothing to do with my work per se, but it's part of my life. And it has been harder and easier in different places. So that's another kind of dimension of it. And I try to generally I try to compartmentalize work and my family life, because that's what works for me. And it's that has helped too as I've moved, just to keep those things separate, you know. But it does mean sometimes that you're like switching hats. It's like, okay, this is the part of the identity I will show this group, and then I'll kind of turn this way and you guys will see this side only. And that I do sometimes find myself feeling like I should resort to that. And that's still tough. Until literally this week, I was on 1-year contracts. So like many lecturers, you don't really have job security. You hope things are going to work out. And for the last few years, you know, my department would always tell me, you know, oh, we fully expect to have you back, of course, unless something drastic happens. I mean, look around right now.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
The drastic happens. And it's a challenge. I mean, it's just a crazy time for everyone. But for people who don't have job security, you know, some people have already lost their jobs in academia, and some aren't getting renewed. So for me, it was a relief, and I feel I now have a new level of privilege, because now I am a senior lecturer. The whole faculty had to vote on me and stamp approval. So that also emboldens me a bit to make sure that I am not I'm not at all hesitant to make sure that my identity is honored, and that I don't feel like I'm trying to downplay things, or and I mean it goes to every level of your work. It's what you decide to wear in the mornings, and whether or not I'm going to do the purple hair, etc. Like it's all sort of connected. And Cass, you're so right, because as you gain those levels of privilege, it's easy to forget how hard it is for those who don't have those things, and how scary it can be, how uncertain it can be. So if I always tell students, find your people as early as you can, and network like mad. It's something that I didn't really do until later. And it would have been a much easier time. I would have been much more focused on my science, which is what I wanted to do. If I'd had sort of a support network and people who understood, because sometimes you're the only woman in the room in physics, and sometimes you're the only queer person, and sometimes you're both, and that's actually kind of a lot. So now I don't feel it as much, because again, I have that privilege. But along the way, the more we can support people coming up. If you're listening to this and you need to support, like, email me. and all these lovely people on this podcast, because I think that's the whole point here, is to
exactly
support and connect.
100%.
I think that's the most important thing too, is being able to find people that are similar to you, that you can, you know, envision yourself becoming one day, whether it's a role model or people that are on your level, and just making sure that you know that there are other people in your situation that are striving for the same things that you are, and that you're not alone in this. You know, there's other people doing it too, and I feel like that support group that you mentioned, I think that's one of the most important things to find. And it can be hard, certainly at you know, conferences or workshops to find that type of group. But it seems like, you know, for the most part, people have been trying to make it a little bit easier to find those people. So, you know, I think the AAS started, the American Astronomical Society started to, you know, provide name tags for gendered pronouns that you can attach onto your own name tag. And so, I mean, things like that, I think, you know, like you were mentioning earlier, it's difficult to find non-cis people at conferences. And so I think that can be a really great way to find them too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, of this group we have gathered here, who amongst us had a role model or role models that we would really, really identify with in this way coming up? Because I didn't really. I had one collaborator, Dr. John Mulcahy, who you know.
Mm-hmm.
I had one collaborator who was out, and we could just sing show tunes while observing. It was great.
That sounds brilliant.
That's a really good point. I mean, it didn't really happen until much later. I think I was already on my second postdoc when I, had that role model. I mean, like going all the way through the undergraduate and grad school. I mean, in grad school, I had peers, right? Other grad students who are also queer and LGBT, but not among the faculty, not among other postdocs. So it's a pretty good question, right? I mean, we grew up without that role models, and it's great to see that the younger generation is not having that problem anymore, at least not to the extent that we had.
Yeah, I would agree to that. I can't think of any astronomers anyway. I've definitely had educators in my life that were out that meant a lot to me, but in astronomy, didn't really have anyone to look up to. But I also have lots of peers, and I think this is a very encouraging sign that, as the years go on, and I'm kind of on a second career myself, so I'm a little older than most of my peers. I see that even in the course of 10 years, attitudes have changed significantly from where we were. Sorry, Vlad is pinned here, but just in the course of 10 years, I've seen a radical transformation in terms of attitudes and the bravery, I would say, of people being out, and yeah, it's been very inspiring for me.
Yes, you're muted.
Yeah, I realised. I was about to stop it. Like, la, 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 la. No one can hear me. I definitely didn't really have any role models. I either growing up or in science, and I think that made me quite thick-skinned. And I think, I would argue that maybe my worst character flaw is I can be a bit scrappy and a bit bullheaded, but I think it's because I get very defensive about things. But I think it's because I felt, in so many ways, isolated and very different growing up. And I think it's, of course that impacts you, right? And you can't undo that, I think. So certainly that was kind of my feeling.
Yeah, I think similar to Cass, I mean, growing up, definitely didn't really have anyone to look up to. In science, and I think Alex was mentioning this earlier, there certainly has been sort of a surgence of out astronomers, which has been great to see. So, if I were to go to an inclusive astronomy conference or women in astronomy conference, there are certainly plenty of people there that I can sort of look up to and know that, this is a possibility for me. I think in terms of having like a solidified like role model, like a specific mentor or advisor or something like that, I guess not quite. I guess it's not as widespread, but I think just seeing people in the field though is encouraging for me.
Yeah, I think the world is changing. It's it's a much kinder place than it was even 10 years ago to be LGBT. Certainly in the Western world. I can't speak for anywhere else. So I don't have any experience of anywhere else, but yeah, I would say that was the case. Okay, maybe we could ask a couple more questions, if that's all right. Sure. So one that I quite like asking people is that a study has suggested that students believe minorities bring political baggage into the classroom, i.e. that the only cool head of objectivity can be a straight, white, cisgender male. What do you think about this?
Bollocks. Oh, sorry.
That's a
Did you want
yes.
more than that? Sorry. I again, this idea that in order to do good science or even social science, because I have a degree in political science too, I know how studies work there too. This idea has really false narrative, right? False narrative that if in order to do this the right way, you have to ignore human things, quote unquote. You have to be completely rational, and that there is a singular viewpoint that is the right viewpoint in order to do the science. That makes no sense to me. And we keep proving over and over again that when you hand a team a problem, the more diverse perspectives on the team, the more unique and effective the solution. We keep proving that. We've proved this in physics, we've proved this in engineering, we've proved this in math, we've proved this over and over again. And we still have this false narrative of just be, you cannot discuss anything political. You cannot bring any part of yourself into this that isn't some sort of magic science robot. It's just not true. And if I put my equity hat on, look, this is a lie that is told in order to continue awarding privilege to a select few. And it's time it's buried out back as far as I'm concerned. I'm very much over it. Sorry, it sounds so jaded now. Oh, so jaded. So, but I do get frustrated by this, because the one thing I hear in education that is a code word for this is rigor. If we change what we're doing, we're lessening the rigor. And that means that our program is no longer excellent, exceptional, etc. And that's not true. Changing the way that you approach your pedagogy in order to be more inclusive does not mean you're dumbing things down. It doesn't mean you're losing the special sauce. But somehow that still pervades the hall of academia, especially in physics. I don't see as many astronomers trolling around with that trope, but they do exist. They definitely do exist.
One thing I heard at another institute was about this idea of objective excellence, and it's kind of like, we don't discriminate, we just judge on objective excellence. And I almost had an aneurysm there and then, because I was just like, somebody has written this criteria of excellence. By any chance were they an old straight white guy? Of course they were.
What are the odds?
Yeah, what are the odds? And it's just kind of like, this definition of excellence, it's subjective. You can put down as many like marking tables as you want and tick boxes, and at the end it's somebody's decided that this is 4 out of 5 and this is 5 out of 5, and chances are the person who decided that was an old straight white guy. I'm just trying to get people to understand this is so difficult.
Yeah, and it's hard, because when I first started feeling like I really had to be more active in terms of pushing for change and making things more equitable and inclusive, one of the first things that I encountered was a resistance to data. And I didn't expect that from scientists. We love data. So I thought, if I can just get the data in the right form, showing the right things, then I'll bring everybody around, no problem. and it's amazing, because kind of no matter what you show certain people, they're not going to accept it. And that has been hard for me to accept, because I'm like, we're scientists. And if you do somehow hold up this idea all the time that we're just objective, etc., if I present you with this evidence, and now now it's not okay. This method that you're saying we should use all the time doesn't apply to things that have anything to do with people. And that was really, really hard for me to get past. I got pretty depressed by that, because there are so many simple things like the peer review, publications, making it so you don't see the author's names and then you can't infer gender when you go and actually review a paper. We've seen the drastic impact of that within 1 or 2 years of making the changes. So why more journals are not going through that process, I don't know. I mean, it's often called blind review. I don't really love that language, but just anonymous review processes make a dent immediately. So that I'm like, just that evidence should be enough to show people, look, this is what's going on.
I had an argument with somebody. Sorry,
they anonymized the Hubble proposals, for example.
Yes.
And the demographics changed overnight.
All of a sudden it was 50-50, right? Men and women PIs. And it was just like, it's almost as if women are just as good at science as men. Huh, who'd have thought?
No one knew.
Yeah, no one knew.
Wow.
You were going to say, Cass?
No, I was going to say exactly that. I had a disagreement with somebody who's an emeritus professor exactly about this, and presented him with this data, and the response I got was basically blah, blah, blah. And you know, I was just like, come on,
jowls at you.
Yeah, literally very, very jowly response. You know, and it's just kind of like, come on, like the data is staring you in the face here. Come on, you know.
Yeah, and it's hard, like, it's hard to see, especially when you're dealing with groups of people, that sort of solidarity rise against any call to change the way things are done or approached or talked about, the language that's used, etc. One of my first years at RIT, another faculty member came to me and said, I have this student who wants me to use these pronouns that I've never heard of and call them, and I don't remember the exact name, I'll just make one up, something like CJ. And the faculty member was clearly upset at this request. And I said, what's the big deal? And they said, well, what if the student asks to be called the Queen of England? Like, I mean,
precisely the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. This equivalency, it's hands up, holds up. Yeah. And then I just said, so what if they do? And the faculty member just stared at me like, well, I'm not going to call them the Queen of England. I'm like, okay, don't call them CJ, like they asked you to. In the first place.
If I can take a hook on that, on that comment, and it's a question that may or may not have to do with your queer identity whatsoever. You mentioned before that you go by Fox, right? So does it have anything to do with your LGBT identity whatsoever? And if it does or doesn't, you know, we can edit it out. So
yeah, sure. Yeah, for me, you know, I mentioned being closeted for a long time. I think Fox is the person I was always supposed to be, but didn't quite manage to get to until I was significantly older, and it was much harder to make it just what everyone called me. So it's funny because I have certain friends who always call me Fox, always. And I have my colleagues who know me as Jen, or the dreaded Jennifer, which just makes me feel like I'm in trouble. Please don't call me Jennifer. Or Jenny, which makes me feel weirdly infantilized. Names are powerful things. They really are. I mean, I did not realize that until I was like 30. Hint, I'm over 30, crowd. I really didn't. I did not see the full power of a name until I became really not just comfortable with my own identity, but a tiny bit militant about it. Like, you can't take this from me. Which, you know, people always talk about, well, you rebel when you're young and then you get more conservative as you get older. I've been the total opposite of that. I've just gotten more and more rebellious over the years and felt more and more like myself. And so it's really nice to have a lot of people in my life now who call me Fox, but sometimes when the rare occasion that those two different groups, the people who think of me as Jen and the people who think of me as Fox, get in the same room, it's really fun confusion.
You know, this touches, yeah, this touches on it's sort of a strange, frustrating phenomenon, I guess. This, I'm coining a term here, I don't know if it's the best one, reverse victimhood, basically. I've encountered this a lot with people that are in the majority, where they say, oh, well, you know, this group wanted to be called this before, and now they want to be called that, and now they want to, you know, where does it end? You know, and you can imagine for any group, a term for a group of people used to be acceptable, and now it's no longer acceptable. And they say, well, what's the problem here? What happened? And you know, that's very frustrating. I've told family members this. I said, you know, really doesn't cost you very much to just refer to people the way that they want to be referred to. I mean, you're really not giving up a whole heck of a lot to just, you know, do right by people and call them what they want to be called. But it seems to happen a lot. It's not just LGBT, obviously, LGBT plus, racial groups, you know, ethnicity groups around the world. We see this all over the place.
Yeah, I sometimes go back to the science here and say, well, when you learn something more about it, you recharacterize and redefine that thing with the new knowledge. What is the big deal? We do this all the time. I think that's actually what science is. You learn more about this,
Totally.
and you change the language around it appropriately. Now, astronomers are bad at this. Like, we're like, well, we called it a planetary nebula, so that's what we'll call it forever, and confuse the heck out of all intro astro students.
Yeah. Late type stars, early type stars, different than late type galaxies and early type galaxies. That one
we
bowled me over.
cling to this line, and let's talk about the magnitude system. I mean, we cling to things sometimes that we shouldn't. And other times you can say, okay, there's a valid reason to continue using this nomenclature or whatever. But in terms of people, no, just you've learned this about them now. They've shared that with you. Let's say that. And I think some people don't want to screw up. Some scientists I find are perfectionists. I definitely have some of those tendencies. And so I think sometimes it's fear that they're going to screw it up, especially when it comes to things like pronouns.
Right.
They're like, they don't even want to entertain the possibility that they're going to be wrong about something. So it's like a defense mechanism to just reject it outright. And then it's just not their problem. Certainly just turn it back to the person who's introduced themselves or asked for this shift, and make it their burden. And that's something that I still see going on quite a lot. Yeah, so for myself, my own relationship with gender has shifted a lot over the years, and I still find it really hard to explain to people who've never ever questioned their gender what it's like, because they just kind of look at you like, are you okay? Like, this must be this is a sign of something bad. And for me, it hasn't been bad at all. It's been really nice to kind of allow myself that freedom. And I look back at my life and I'm like, there were definitely years where I was presenting male pretty big time. That's how I wanted to express at that point, and how I express now is different. And I would like to say that I feel totally free to express however I want. I don't always. Sometimes that has to do with teaching the population that I do. And I should mention that most of my students are lovely, amazing people who have no problem at all using whatever pronouns you ask them to use or name you ask them to use at all. It's only a handful. It's harder when I have really large classes and I don't get the chance to know students well. And that's where I still find the pressure sometimes, not only to make sure I look professional so that they believe I know something about physics because I'm a woman in the room, but also that I don't come out right on the first day and confuse them with the way I'm presenting, so that they're going, wait, I don't know what to call, what are we calling this person? So I've taken with smaller classes to actually making sure that there's language in my syllabus that makes it really clear that people are going to be called what they want to be called, and that we're going to talk about things if things get awkward and if something is said that makes us uncomfortable. And so I try to set the norms right up front. And sometimes, depending on the group, I'll also say, you know, I tend to go by she, her, but they, them feels pretty good a lot of the time. And most of the time, the students just go, oh, okay, all right, that's fine. It's only when you have kind of big group think going on in these large classes where they're trying to find, they hate the physics. They don't want to be there. So I find sometimes it brings the worst out in people when you're in that environment. It's a learning environment, so you hope everybody is excited to be there, but there are classes they don't really want to take. And there are classes with reputations. Oh my gosh, physics. It's the worst. And the students, some are math phobic, so that brings the level of tension right up, and they're looking for reasons not to like me. They're looking for reasons to justify that they're not feeling great about being in my class. And again, that's just a small subset, but when you've got hundreds of students, those show up on the histogram, so to speak. So I do find sometimes that I still, when I'm getting dressed in the morning, don't just think about what I want to wear. I think about what I should wear, and not just in a professional, yes, of course, you know, no giant folds in the jeans, etc., but just what I should be wearing to.
That's really interesting, and I wonder how much you know, say if everything about you was kind of the same, but you were, you know, mostly presented as a man, and you identified as a man, would you have to put this much thought into your wardrobe?
So I should preface that I love thinking about my wardrobe and have way too many like space and nerd related things, and some like subtle nerd things and some outright nerd things. I like thinking about my wardrobe. Fashion is fun, but I totally get your meaning. Like, would I have to worry basically about how it would be, how it would be interpreted? And when you mentioned that you feel like you have male privilege, that goes back to it too, right? Maybe if I dressed and presented that way, I would be more privileged. You know, I don't know. It's a dance I don't particularly love to do, but still find myself some mornings.
Yeah, I hate it too, but I still find myself like I put on my suit, and you know, it's kind of, my wife calls it my power lesbian suit, and I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. Like, you know, I started, I put it on, and I'm just like, yeah, I'm sharp, I'm ready to go. Yeah, it is, and it's like playing into like people's perceptions of making yourself a more like kind of masculinized version of who you are, I suppose, for, you know, being seen as more credible somehow.
Yeah. And I was just thinking that the best power lesbian suit I've ever seen, I saw very recently, and it included a flannel tie.
Excellent. That's fantastic.
I'm gonna need that.
I had to approach this person was a stranger on the street. This was before COVID hit, so it was okay to go up to them. But I was just like, your tie is amazing. And the person just looked at me like, yeah, it is. Oh, so good. Such good vibes.
So
well,
good.
If I can chime in on that a bit, yeah, I mean, it was mentioned, like, if I was a man, would they need to care that much about wardrobe? I would say probably not as much, but there is a level of caring about that too. But it ties up to the whole idea of the acceptable behavior or image that minorities can have. I mean, I do that when I am conscious when I'm teaching an undergraduate class as opposed to when I'm teaching a graduate class. So when I teach undergraduate, I try to go, you know, like with a suit and tie. And in a graduate course, I try to be like like more close, right, to these students. So it's something that I noticed, that an undergraduate is going to respect you less, like if you look like, if you look as young as they are, whereas graduate course, the graduates, they tend to like that more, right? Than so it's something that I noticed. I don't know to which extent that's true, but that's some care that goes in there. And I was once talking to a woman in the field, and she said something that struck as part of that too. She said that she was once in a meeting, like with a visitor to her institute. They were talking about like their work, and the day after, or a couple of days after, they had another meeting with the same person, right? And in that day she had to teach, so she was on a suit and the visitor thought it was a completely different person and didn't even realize that it wasn't, because in the first meeting it was dressed like every day, like with braids and so on. And the guy kept saying, "Oh, we were just talking about that the other day. So bad that you are not here." It's insane. Like the way that you show your image can completely, can get to, the way that it gets transmitted to the other person, it can completely look like another person, and that they may or may not even listen to.
When I was very young,
that's really interesting. Sorry, please go on, Jen. Sorry.
When I was very young, I got a very, very short haircut, what would be considered like a traditional butch haircut. And that was the first time I thought about my gender, because I was being mistaken for a boy a lot, which I didn't like. It confused me. But I would every summer I swam on the kind of local swim team from the time I was tiny. And for many years I had the same coach, and she was awesome. She was motivating and accepting and lovely, and it was one of the few places I felt I could just kind of relax myself. But she always saw me with a swim cap on. And one day we were in something like Walmart, kind of a department store, and I saw my coach, and I said, "Hey, Coach Bonnie." And she looked right at me, very confused. Who is this person talking to me? So she's just furrowing her eyebrows, and I said, hi, Coach Bonnie." And she went, "Do I know you?" Now, this is someone who'd known me for years, but at that point, I had very long, very blonde hair. And she'd never seen me not with a swim cap on. So she did not recognize this person that she was literally a mentor for. And when it clicked for her, it was amazing watching her face kind of go through this, like, what? Like, how could I not recognize this kid who I've known for years? Sometimes small changes make a big difference. In the way that we're sort of interpreted almost. I feel like it's like, how is my person being interpreted by what I'm wearing right now? And I know it's not the same, but I sometimes think about like contouring makeup about this. It's kind of like, we best not tell the men that we can shapeshift in case they tell the church, it's like I absolutely wrote a long essay in high school about the power of makeup, and that women who wear makeup have this like secret arsenal at their disposal. You don't want to look tired? That we can fix that. But I've also had the occasion where I've been at work on the weekend and I haven't had as much makeup on as I normally wear during the week. And in every case where I walk by a male colleague and chat for a second, they'd always say, "Well, you look tired." Like, right, I just don't have my normal makeup on. That's my magic.
This is just my face. Yeah.
I look like this, and yes, I'm probably tired because I'm a professor and we're all tired.
Oh my God, I have said that, to women colleagues. I'm sorry.
Got it. Vlad, take it off the possibility for response list. Like, no possible response includes to a woman colleague, you look tired. Nope.
No. I mean, I say that because, like when I hear that on my side, is because, I pulled an all-nighter and I'm looking awful. And I say, oh, good that you noticed. But I guess that if I say that to a woman colleague, it's not a good thing to say.
Yeah,
because just asking how people are is better.
Yeah.
Instead of saying like, you look this way, like just how are you doing? Then they might go, I'm great, and you go, great, awesome. Or they might go, I'm tired, and then you can still have that whole discussion, and you can still be compassionate and make it clear that you noticed them and saw them, without falling into the accidental hole of, oh no, she's just, her hair's back, or her makeup's different, or something that is atypical from your version of that person is showing up to you, and now you're interpreting it as something bad.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? So like when I often if I go for like a job interview or something, I put makeup on because it hides the fact that I'm like perpetually tired, right? But then the first day on the job, I'm just like, I'm not wearing makeup because you expect it from me. And then if I turn up one day without makeup, people are just like, God, you look sick. Are you all right? So I just don't wear makeup to work. When I worked in a bar, always wore like a full face of makeup, lipstick, everything. And then one day I was really late for work. I'd like completely got the time wrong. It was really late. Like, so I had to I'd just been playing football. So turned up at this bar, and like someone came behind the bar to be like, who are you? And I was just like, I work here. And they were like, oh my God, Cass. It wasn't until like I opened my mouth that they realized who I were. They're just like, I didn't recognize you. And I was just like, that's because makeup is really war paint.
Yeah. And it's like you can hide perceived weakness. And I definitely struggle with that. So I have a disability that developed later in life. And so I was in a wheelchair for a while, and then used a cane sometimes as a mobility aid. And that cane is something I struggle with because I don't always need it. And so what will happen is if I have it, and if a colleague hasn't seen me in a while, they say, oh no, what did you do? And so I try to laugh at these things. Like, I'm a bisexual who keeps coming out, but I'm also a disabled person who has to keep doing that whole speech as well. Because people forget that someone might need a mobility aid sometimes and not always, and nothing's really changed for them. So it's also like if they see me without the cane, they think I'm not in pain, which is not true basically ever, because of the condition that I have. And that's another way that like my appearance and what I'm choosing to show people can kind of mess with my head. It really makes you wonder, like, okay, am I perceived as weak because I'm using my cane? And who do I want to really tell the story to? Do I want to keep bothering with the story, or just abridge it in some way that's not really truthful, but it avoids me having to talk about the fact that I'm actually in pain all the time? So that's another thing that for me, like in the mornings, it's like, do I really need the cane? And fortunately, my pain management has improved a lot over the last year or so. So I don't usually have it. Very rare that I need it anymore. But I should be able to use it whenever I need it without any problem, without people questioning whether or not I've managed to harm myself, which also seems to be the default assumption. I was like, I guess I am klutzy, but at the same time, it's really hard for people not to say like, oh, how are you feeling? As opposed to, what did you do? Like it's your fault. So I've definitely learned a lot from the able-bodied initially to now someone who has a disability perspective about how people perceive you and what changes about their assumptions of your competence, depending on whether or not you're someone who has a visible disability. And we have many deaf students on our campus because the National Technical Institute for the Deaf is also on RIT's campus. So I've learned a ton from those students as well about how they're perceived. And oftentimes they're perceived as dumb because they are deaf. And I have to say, I love the deaf LGBTQ culture so much. They're like super direct and they network so well. Like I've learned to network from a lot of those students at NTID. They are out and proud and just fabulous about it. So it's many layers of, like, we talk about intersectionality a lot, right? And sometimes I think we try to rank, like, okay, is it hard to be a woman in physics? Is it harder to be a queer person in physics? Like, it all depends on exactly where you are, your level of privilege at the time that you're experiencing it. So much plays together. It's like you are one big song. You're not like this single note is the thing that's dominating. It can change from place to place or from your role in that environment. If that changes, then again, everything can shift for you. So like finding your footing sometimes, especially as astronomers move around a lot, can be a little challenging, I think, for queer people, but also people who just are not in the majority group in whatever way.
Yeah, thank you. That's been really insightful. I you know, it's hard to consider intersectionality, I think, and you know, I think disability as well, especially like hidden disabilities, another thing that can be difficult. Sorry, Vlad, go on. What were you going to say?
No, I was just gonna ask, but I'm worried about the time too. It says here that we only have remaining 3 minutes, right. So I think we should wrap up. But you know, on what you mentioned about visibility, one of the issues about being bi, right, is the whole bi erasure thing that we tend to be pigeonholed, right, as either gay or straight. And I noticed that in my own experience, like when I date men, I come out with actions, right? I mean, I can bring a boyfriend to gatherings or in small talk, right? I mean, asking, I mean, like someone asks, "So what did you do last night?" So, "Oh yeah, well, I went out with my boyfriend to a pub or so." And right now, you know, dating someone of the opposite gender, you tend to come out more with words, right? You have to say it, otherwise people pigeonhole it as a straight person. And I was wondering if that's something that you experienced too, and in which way, and did it impact your everyday interactions at work?
Yeah, sometimes it's odd as someone who's bi because you may read into something in a conversation and go, oh, does this person think I'm straight? Do I now have to make it clear that I'm not? Is it my job to make it clear that I'm not? Like, what is my relationship with this person? Have I actually told them before and they've just forgotten? It's like an extra level of insecurity in some interactions where I feel like if I was in the majority group on that, I just wouldn't have that spinning in my head at all. And, you know, it's even within the community, sometimes I haven't always felt really comfortable in the community. I've had experiences where people have just said, well, bi isn't actually an identity. You're either a confused lesbian or a confused straight person. And I've also had people say, well, it's the same thing as pan. And that's like a valid discussion that I want to have, whereas the whole you're just confused thing really annoys me. So sometimes good conversations can happen when you're having to come out again. And then sometimes it's just bloody annoying and it makes you feel unseen. It really, erasure is the right word. Like you just feel like some whole part of you was just assumed and it's not yours, and like somehow belongs to the other person who's doing the perceiving. And that's rough. You have to kind of make sure you don't give people too much power over you in terms of the way you're perceived. because you can't control it. You really can't. And try not to worry too much, pick your fights, because sometimes it's worth having the discussion and saying, actually, I've explained this before and it's still true, even if I'm dating someone who is the opposite gender.
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes you just go, sure, whatever, and move on with life and let that go. But that, I think, takes your experience.
This touches on something that, you know, your experience with your disability. I mean, I see somewhat of a parallel here. Obviously, they're different experiences, but, you know, talking about this decision that you have to make about whether or not I should bring my cane today, because do I even want to have that conversation? And the way that we make similar kind of choices in this community about, like, well, I want to be out, but do I really want to even bother? And you know, and then people saying, well, what's the big deal? Why do you even have to talk about it? That kind of thing. Obviously very different experiences, but I just kind of saw this parallel that you're having to make a choice that you don't, I mean, that's insane to me that you have to make that choice at all, but it's still something that's going through your mind.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way. I mean, there's definitely a parallel there. I find that gives me perspective too on what the people around me might be having to choose every day, and what might be going through their heads. Even, you know, I have a dear colleague who is gay, and boy, flamboyant is probably the best word that I know of at the moment. Might not be the right word. But for him, you know, that's been something he's struggled with his whole life, you know, even when he was very, very, very young. And that's not fair. I think we all know that that's not fair. And we have to just keep pushing and help each other as much as we can, speak up for each other, but also realize that sometimes we have to focus on preserving ourselves. And you can't fight every single battle. You can't get too much in your head about these things. You have to sort of, okay, I've had the thought, I've questioned that, now let's move on. Or I've heard this and it's actually not that big of a deal. I don't need to particularly get involved right here. I'll move on. That is the balance that I think is hardest in our community, because sometimes we do need to scream and yell and fight very visibly. And then day to day, sometimes we have to say, it's not worth it.
Right.
In this particular moment, it's not worth it. You know, we might circle back on this one at some point, but it's just, not today. And both of those things are true and okay. And people need to fight the way they can to improve things. I mean, we mentioned earlier, in a lot of ways, things have improved. And we should also celebrate those victories, because I catch myself sometimes drowning in all the stuff that's still not right and getting real mad about the stuff that's not right. At the same time, when we have a victory, even if it's just a tiny little thing, I'm just like, oh, celebrate the heck out of that. And that goes for personal accomplishments too. I found that in times when I was struggling with how my identities fit in the field and whether I belonged there, because that's always the word I come back to, whether I belong. When I'm really struggling with that, if I can find the little things that, oh no, that worked out, or I did that, or I was part of this thing that was really great, celebrate the heck out of them. And right now that rings really true for me, because I feel like, well, COVID is unraveling so much of our security, and we're seeing so many people affected. I've had students extraordinarily ill in the last few weeks that I've just been worried sick about and up all night, etc. And so every little tiny victory, I'm gonna dance it out, like however you do party, just really embrace it and be proud, right? We better embrace the pride, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great note to leave it on.
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
just really appreciate you joining us today. Some fabulous insights from your career and your experience. And so,
yeah, thank you so much.
I think
It was really wonderful to connect with all of you, and thank you for what you're doing. I'm really grateful that there are people like you folks out there who are connecting, helping us connect over great distances and all sorts of identities. Thank you.
Oh,
It's a pleasure.
Sounds like butter now.
Great.
What was that, Fred?
My heart now is melting, you know. It's like butter.
I'm going to teach. Do you know how you say yay if you're deaf?
Was that, sorry?
Do you know how to say yay if you're deaf?
Yay, no. Oh, really?
Hey, this is also like you did a great job.
Nice.
Awesome.
And I do this all the
good
time.
on that.
They're not technically jazz hands. They're a little close. I think you got to go this way with jazz hands. But like when I have that feeling, I was trying to like, yay. You know, together we can actually make stuff better. Gosh, we just have to remember it and all the time. And I really am. I'm so grateful that you all are doing this, taking the time and effort and energy to talk to people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who's watching. This has been another episode of Out in Space, and we'll be bringing you more interviews with LGBT plus astronomers and related folks in the near future. So please stay tuned. Once again, I'm Alex, and everybody can introduce themselves. We got to get this down.
We got to get this down. Maybe we should just record it and slice it in, and then we don't have to do it every time.
Yeah, maybe.
I think we should just have numbers. We just know which numbers we do from now on.